So thanks for coming back on the show, man. I know this is our Out of the Loop series. It's a little bit of a different format where we go over a lot of these news events that go in one ear and out the other. And with China, well, who better to talk to about China than you guys? But also, it's a little bit confusing even for us China watchers because China's been under zero COVID policy for a while. They went into lockdowns. We didn't hear a whole lot about it. ... People throwing chairs at guys in white suits all over TikTok and Instagram. What is happening?
Yeah, so I guess, the biggest thing that really kicked this off was there was this fire that happened in Xinjiang. So this is all the way in Western China. And I gotta be honest with you, I was surprised at how much coverage this fire was getting because fires in China and then the firefighters and police and their lack of access to people in the buildings that catch on fire is a very common occurrence throughout the entire country. This is not like a new thing. But for some reason, this specific event in Xinjiang just really triggered off a wave of protests of just people that wanted to show their solidarity with the victims in the building. People wanted to have candlelight vigils and things like this. And it was almost like the violent crackdown from the authorities across the country for these candlelight vigils, for these protests, was what really kind of created a reaction against the authorities. It created this situation where it happened in a city called Urumqi. They had kind of this protest or candlelight vigil type thing on a road in Shanghai called Urumqi Road because it was symbolic of the area. And then when the cops started cracking down on it, people were like, what are you talking about? We can't have a candlelight vigil. What are you talking about? We can't mourn over these people. And that's really what sparked this off. But it was a simultaneous thing. There was another really important thing that happened, and it was a rare...
let me pause it. Let me stop you right here. So for people who don't know, Xinjiang, that's where the Uyghurs live. We've done shows on the Uyghur genocide. It's a little bit weird, man, that... And I'm grateful to hear it. I'm glad to hear it. But it's a little bit odd that a fire in a place where a lot of people in China think, oh, that's where the terrorist separatists live, that was the tipping point. Because you would almost think, and I guess this just shows how wrong I am about how people think about Xinjiang, inside Shanghai at least, you would almost think they would go, oh, well, those aren't real Chinese people. They're not Han Chinese people. But that's not what happened. You'd almost think they'd let something like that go more because it is so far away from the Han Chinese areas. If there was a fire in Shanghai and the same amount of deaths happened because of this crazy occurrence where, and to clarify, the reason so many people died in this fire is because if I understand it correctly, the residents of that building were welded into the building because of COVID lockdowns. It's not like lockdowns here where they say, please don't go outside. You're literally trapped in your own building like a prison.
Right. So they didn't have access to it. And I would actually agree with you that it seems kind of weird that there would be kind of so much support from Han Chinese people elsewhere throughout China. However, I do want to counter, because I don't want there to be any misinformation. A huge chunk of Urumqi are Han people. And, a lot of the discourse and stuff was coming from Han people within Urumqi, right? When I looked at the protests that were on Urumqi streets, I saw the vast majority of people were Han Chinese people. So that's just something to keep in mind. But there's another thing. It was a rare coordinated effort I saw throughout 79 plus universities around China. And this is, if anything's going to happen in China, I always thought it's definitely going to happen from the educated populace. It's going to be happening from the people that have access to VPNs or even just have a better understanding of what the outside world is probably like. And this coordinated effort, it was there was this white paper going around talking about all of the problems that the zero COVID policy has brought. There was insinuations that the Chinese government was doing things wrong. And this was a moment in something I hadn't seen since Tiananmen Square in 1989, where all of these students in all of these universities pretty much at the same time stood up and had their speeches. They had their loudspeakers. They organized protests. They had graffiti movements. All of these things came together to really paint the Chinese government in a very negative light. And I've never seen something so coordinated in a country that cracks down so much on coordinated efforts or demonstrations. So that was really the beginning.
This is interesting because I think a lot of people go, so what? There's a lot of, white paper, schwipe paper. There's all kinds of articles in the United States about how our government screwed this up or that up. It happens in Europe. It happens in Canada. It doesn't really happen in China. You don't have coordinated efforts that say, hey, our dictator, our government, our infallible Communist Party is implementing a policy that actually really sucks and is wrong and is backwards and is incorrect and the result is bad. That just doesn't happen.
No. And again, I think what people have to understand too is that you can't look at this through a Western lens or even a lens of any other country, because China has, spent the past few years creating the most robust surveillance state in the entire world. Everything you do is tied to your national ID card. So everything you post online is not anonymous. Everything that you do in the streets could be you could be facial recognized throughout the camera or through the camera system. You have to use your QR code, which was started, during the COVID pandemic, to allow yourself access to banks, restaurants, public areas. Right. All of this stuff has been created to create levels of surveillance where no one can get away with anything. Right. And the crazy thing is as big brother as this is rarely used to prevent actual crime. This surveillance state is rarely used to go catch a guy that stole someone's bike. This surveillance state is being used to stop gatherings of people, right? So that's why, to go back to the protest thing, it was so shocking to see this many people come together in a anti-government policy / turned into anti-government protest. And to see that many people coordinate in a system that doesn't allow any coordination, where they can stop a WeChat group. WeChat is the app that Chinese people use to talk to each other, to stop it in its tracks before anyone can make plans. Hey, meet me on Nanjing Lu over there. Hey, we're going to meet here at this time. They can stop all that before it even happens, before people even come together, right? So it shows you these protests actually, without the surveillance state, these protests could have been massive, like absolutely huge. But to see that much coordination was shocking to me.
I see. So since the government and security apparatus controls all the online discussion groups, the fact that these protests got so big with that control in place means that without that control in place, they could have been 10 times the size. This was just an unstoppable force, which is, again, highly unusual. And protests don't happen like this in China ever. You mentioned the last big one was 1989, Tiananmen Square. Can you, I don't know if you're a history expert on this off the top of your head, but do you remember the death toll of that event and how big the scale of that event was by any chance?
There's no way to know officially, just because it was, it's been erased from the annals of history. But the estimates are anywhere from, 1,000 to upwards of 10,000 students murdered during that protest, right? And the thing about that is that it's something that has been lost in the memory of all the Chinese people that weren't there, because they weren't taught in school about this thing. But it's one of those things that's like the first thing you see when you get a VPN is like stuff about Tiananmen Square. It's just like, it's almost like you're greeted with that's like the first confrontational bit of information.
Is that because people are looking for it because they've heard about it in whispers and they're like, okay, I finally have Google Tiananmen Square?
I have no statistics on this, but I can say this. The vast majority of people, when I lived in China for 10 years, the vast majority of people that I knew about it, which, by the way, was in the minority, but the vast majority of people that did know about it found out because they either had a professor in a different area, so maybe in Hong Kong or Macau, that talked about it, or they had friends that studied in a different country that heard about it in their classes, and then what they would do is that would inspire them to try to find a way to get a VPN, and that's one of the first things they would look up. But yeah, the vast majority of people I know in China didn't even really know about it, or if they did know about it, it's kind of like, that was like a bad, crazy group of students that got cracked down by the government. They were just separatists. It was a CIA color revolution.
Right, yeah. I shouldn't say always. I often will ask my Chinese teachers who are in China if they've heard of this protest. And some of them say no, and some of them say yes, and then they don't want to talk about it. And others say yes, and then they'll talk about it, and then their internet gets disconnected and our lesson ends, which I used to think that was a funny coincidence, but it's happened like 10 times and is definitely not a coincidence anymore.
Not a coincidence.
Which is the most 1984 thing kind of ever.
Sure.
In fact, one teacher, we talked about it, we got disconnected, and the next time we talked, when I asked her something, I said, hey, what happened last time? She did like this with her mouth, and she was like, no, like just literally don't even ask me about this, because she probably had the police come and knock on her door and be like, maybe don't talk about that anymore. I have to look at your gas meter, or whatever the euphemism is. And I've shown the Tankman photo on Skype to some teachers, and they've never seen it. This is such a weird thing. If you so Google Tankman if you don't know what this is, but it's one of the most famous photos in the world. It's from Tiananmen Square. It's a man standing in front of a tank, and that man has never been seen again, of course, after that, because he got disappeared by the police, or the secret police, whatever, in China, the Communist Party, after this photo was taken. And it's one of the most iconic photos. Like, if you had top 10 most iconic photos in history, that's going to be in there. And almost no one, and you can test this with friends. If you have friends who are in China, you can test this by showing them this, and they almost certainly will have not seen this photo, whereas almost everyone in the rest of the world who has internet / has gone to school for any length of time has seen this photo.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a great catalyst to talk about something else. And that is because when you look at a photo like this, when you see Tankman, you see something so iconic that's not really permeated the zeitgeist in China, you'd have to say, like, well, it's crazy that people aren't making comparisons in the current protests, like in China, to this, right? But I think the most important part of that photo is what happened to Tankman afterwards. Like you said, absolutely, he was disappeared. Nobody knows where he is now, right? That's what's currently happening now, right? And I think there's a huge, huge problem with, and I hate using the term mainstream media or Western media, but
yeah, because it makes us sound like those weird, like creepy
tinfoil
left
hat,
or right wing
like
tinfoil hat. Yeah, exactly.
No, that's not where I'm going with this. Where I'm going is the short-sightedness of looking at these protests is dangerous. And I'll tell you why. It's dangerous for the Chinese people, and it's dangerous for future demonstrations as well, because what happened to Tankman afterwards, he was disappeared. And I feel like that's really not part of the dialogue. That's not like, people look at that and they're like, oh, they either assume he was like run over, or, oh, like this shows the brutality of the crackdown on the protesters in Tiananmen Square. But nobody's talking about the aftermath of what's happening with the protests right now in China. And what's happening is, I'm turning on the news and I'm seeing people say, look, it seems like the protests worked. China's reducing their COVID restrictions. Look, China's rolling back COVID restrictions because of the protesters. And it's almost insinuating that the Chinese government is listening to their citizens, and that it's some sort of reforming country that allows dissent and discourse to kind of influence policy. And that's just simply not the case. And I can actually just say something that's fairly breaking right now. What's happening in Guangzhou. Guangzhou is a first-tier city in the south of China. There was tons and tons of protests against zero COVID policy and against Xi Jinping and the CCP.
First-tier city means what? Like over 5 million people? In the U.S., it would be New York, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, etc. Cities everybody knows.
So first-tier city, there's only 4 of them in China. There's Guangzhou, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing. Okay. Those are the big ones. It's less to do with population, more to do with like infrastructure and influence.
Gotcha.
So, anyway, Guangzhou, one of the main cities of China, huge area for these protests. Right now, literally right now, the police and secret police are doing a mass arrest of all of the protesters that participated. And I'm talking about from the people that were throwing the gates, like you said, at the pandemic workers and the police, all the way down to the people that held up a blank piece of paper, an A4 size piece of paper, the A4 revolution, so to speak.
Let's talk about that for a second, because I think people have probably gone on social media and seen people yelling at guys in white suits, and they don't necessarily know what those people are. It looks like a kind of a B-roll from a pandemic movie, like a crappy low-budget one, because a bunch of dudes in like kind of cheap looking, not really hazmat suits, more like paint suits with a mask on, and they're getting a temporary barricade chucked at them while people film on an Android phone. Right. And I'm making a joke out of it, but it's like, it's very serious, obviously, because these people are fighting for the end to the lockdown. But it went from these protests. I think the significant part here is that we maybe missed is This protest went from, hey, man, I got to go to the store and buy food. I got to get medicine for my baby who's got a fever. I've got an old person in here who needs health care, et cetera. The protest went from that, because they've been locked down for months, to, wait a minute. Actually, you know what? What I want is for you to listen to me. Maybe I need more rights, not just the right to go to the grocery store because I'm in an authoritarian regime that has too strong of a lockdown. Maybe we need democracy. And the chants on the songs kind of went from just banging pots and pans because they wanted to be let out of their house to maybe we need a regime change because nobody's listening to us over in Beijing. And people started holding up these A4-sized white pieces of paper. What's that all about?
So there's this idea that, hey, if you're going to hold up slogans, like, I don't know if your audience remembers Bannerman. Bannerman's a guy that stood on Sitong Bridge in Beijing and unveiled a banner with a bunch of kind of like a manifesto of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
Say no to the lockdowns. Xi Jinping step down. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, which does not happen. That's like going, no, Kim Jong-il, you're not a good leader.
That guy was Tankman 2.0.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're gonna unveil a banner like that, you're dead. You're just dead, right? They will black bag you and take you away and probably torture you and kill you, right? So the idea is that if you unveil a banner with something on it, that's what gets you arrested. But hey, how can you get arrested for just holding a blank piece of paper? Because everyone knows what you want to say. And so the implication was everyone knows what I want to say, right?
But I'm not allowed to say it.
But I'm not allowed to say it. So if I hold up that blank piece of paper and everyone does it, it sends a massive signal. And then people will start looking it up, right? You got hashtag A4 revolution after that, A4 being the size of the paper, right? So that became like this very easy to spread protest method. And one thing I wanted to mention, I think it's really important. You brought up a really good point. To go from saying, I don't want to be locked in my house anymore, to go from saying like, I want to be able to go out and buy groceries, to I want Xi Jinping to step down, I want the CCP to step down, is a pretty massive leap, right? Especially in China. I think people, I got to understand, this is not like in the US where you maybe change your opinion from, I don't like I don't know, I can't think of a good example. I don't like a current Biden policy to like, right. I want communism in the country. It's not,
right. I mean? I guess an actual kind of real example here would be somebody who says, I don't want to have to get the COVID vaccine to go to work. And then the next week they're going, you know what? Actually, we need to blow up the White House and everyone in it needs to be murdered. It's like, whoa, whoa, man, calm down. That's not, where did that come from? And, and that's what we're looking at with China, because the bridge guy, banner guy, he threw that banner up there. And despite all of this being censored and shut down on social media in China, people still found out about it, and people were airdropping this message to other people, photographs of it, to the point where didn't Apple have to get involved somehow to explain this? Because this is crazy to me.
Yeah, so, AirDrop, for everyone out there that doesn't use Apple, AirDrop is a tool on your Apple phone that you can use, well, any Apple device that you can use to send files to other people with an iPhone or another Apple device. And this doesn't use like the traditional internet, right? You're not uploading to some sort of server where the government could just, see what's in that folder.
It's phone to phone.
It's phone to phone. So like I could send you a picture of a Winnie the Pooh meme or something, right? So this was happening. This was happening all over Shanghai and Beijing, where people were taking Bannerman's manifesto, so all of his things, no more lockdown, no more Xi Jinping, blah, 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 blah. And they were making stylized pictures and sending it to each other phone to phone through AirDrop. And what happened was actually, I saw there was this post that was going around in China saying it was some sort of tech group that was run by the Chinese government talking about how they immediately needed to come up with some way to stop this. And that you, as a user, shouldn't accept any pictures or anything from AirDrop because you could be politically liable, right? You could be liable for detention, things like this. So
like,
it was
there's
trying to
a phrase that
people.
Doesn't exist in the United States or the rest of the free world, politically liable.
Yeah, correct. So you could potentially be punished for something that somebody sends you, right? And so that was an effort to scare people. But then what we saw was Apple actually capitulate to the Chinese government in China and turn off a certain feature of AirDrop that means that you wouldn't be able to receive stuff necessarily automatically from a stranger, right? So it effectively stopped this whole airdrop revolution thing where they're trying to send these documents to each other.
Right, because right now, if I have AirDrop and I allow everyone to send me things, people can freely send me unsolicited dick pics on my phone while I'm on an aircraft, which is what happens all the time, by the way. Every time I'm on a damn plane, someone's trying to send me something with AirDrop, and sometimes it's a funny meme, and usually it's something disgusting because people are crazy. But you just leave it on and you can receive anything and it says, do you want to accept this? And you're like, sure, whatever, unknown user, who cares? That got turned off in China. I think now you can use AirDrop, but it turns off automatically after like 5 minutes or something like that. So that if your friend wants to send, 10 minutes. So if your friend wants to send you something, they can do it. But you have to know to turn it on, which effectively stops somebody from hanging out on a park bench in the center of Beijing and just sending it to everybody who will accept it because nobody's got their AirDrop on. You can't just leave it on. And Apple rewrote that software for the Chinese Communist Party to be able to censor the free spread of information, which is mind-blowing, but also not terribly surprising because the consequences were probably either you don't sell a single iPhone here or make another one here ever, and we close all your stores, or you rewrite this piece of code and don't tell anyone.
There's a bit of a double-edged sword because like they did that and then simultaneously made the announcement that they're pulling most production out of China. So I don't know.
Yeah, they just didn't want to do it tomorrow, right? Which is what they would have had to be facing, which is kind of, they were between a rock and a hard place because when you get in bed with the devil, and I don't mean that in a religious way, but when you do a deal with the devil, you don't necessarily get to dictate all the terms. Like that's the whole idea. So if you're using slave labor or near slave labor in another country to create a product, you can't be upset when the slave driver says, "Hey, by the way, I'm changing my policy," and you have no choice because that's what you're dealing with.
It's that you are making a deal with the devil at that point. Mm-hmm. That's the turn of phrase, right? So
exactly.
That's a good point actually, because that was one of the many efforts that the Chinese government was doing to stop this. They were trying to stop this from spreading all the way down to like the minute detail, like something like AirDrop, where you wouldn't even think would be a protest tool at that point. It's kind of like akin to dropping balloons of leaflets over North Korea. I mean, the average person's not going to know about this. So the fact that they were going to that level and they're investigating all the people like putting up down with Xi Jinping spray paint in bathrooms, which to the average person doesn't mean anything, but in China is huge. They're sending their top like secret police and investigators, like the equivalent of the FBI, to go figure out who spray painted in a bathroom, right?
Imagine you make it to the top of your class at Beijing University and you're like a master of all of these different spy methodologies and tradecraft, and they're like, all right, here's what you're going to be doing this week. Every public restroom in Beijing, we want you to inspect that thing top to bottom. Get in there, man. Get in there. Here's a paint marker.
But it shows you what why the Chinese government does this, because it can really, really change, right? So to go back, it goes from I want to go grocery shopping and not be locked down anymore because I heard my neighbors starve to death, to down with Xi Jinping. And I'll tell you, I watched this happen on video so that you can see clips where people in the crowd they're so shocked already that there's a protest. They're like, holy shit, what is actually happening in my street here in China? There are people on the street protesting and throwing stuff at cops, right? That's already a shock. Then you can hear people ask, what is this about, right? Oh, it's about zero COVID lockdown. And then the protests will say something like, down with the Chinese government, right? 共产党下台, like come step down CCP.
Step down,
And then all of a sudden, the IE, or I can say the 50, 60-year-old woman behind the camera who's filming this protest goes, you know what? Yeah, step down, government, And it's that quick because there's so much repressed buildup of frustration that we're talking like almost 3 years of lockdowns that have created. People aren't stupid. They know where this is coming from. The Chinese government has tried so hard to say, oh, anytime there's bullshit happening where people are upset about the lockdowns, that's just a local issue, right?
Right.
They've tried this for so long and it usually works, but there is so much pent-up frustration when it finally affects that person. They say, wait a minute, this is happening to me too, right? And I did a sample, right? I talked to people that I knew would have no idea about these protests. They would have absolutely no clue, right?
You talking about
And
Americans or Chinese people?
No, Chinese people. Okay. And I talked to people in China and I said, hey, is everything okay? I heard about these protests right in the midst of everything, right? And the person would say, oh yeah, that was just one road in Guangzhou, right? And in my mind, I'm like, wait, this is in like 100 cities, right? That was just on one road in Guangzhou. And by the way, that has nothing to do with anything. Those were migrant workers. They were
That's
from
what my Chinese
Hubei.
teacher said. No, it's just very local. It's very small.
Yeah.
I've never seen it. Also, I think the audio on the videos that you're looking at is fake. And I'm like, these are like videos from people in crowds. This is not CNN fabricating a bunch of crap to make China look bad, but okay.
No. So the idea was that, if you can localize and place a blame on something that has nothing to do with you, right, then all of a sudden it becomes a distant issue. And the Chinese government uses this dissonance on purpose all the time. But again, during these protests is the first time I saw that break down. That kind of narrative broke down because I think the lockdowns became so prolific that it's not just Wuhan is locked down. Oh, just Guangzhou is locked down. Now it's like, okay, we went through a bunch of lockdowns too, and I'm tired of it. So all of a sudden it becomes tantalizing to say, yeah, maybe this is coming from the top, right?
You know what this also shows me is that, and this is true for authoritarian regimes all over the place, North Korea, China, Belarus, you're just, in an authoritarian regime, you're just never sure how many people agree with what's in your head, especially if you're a dissident, right? You might get wasted with your college roommate or whatever you have and go, you know what? It's pretty freaking screwed up that we have to do X, Y, Z. And if you're 7 whiskeys in, they might be like, yeah, you know what? This is a bunch of crap. And you sober up the next day and you go, did we talk about that? Do we want to pretend we don't remember that? And it's like, maybe we don't talk about that with everybody on the whole floor and the whole class. And you just don't, that's sort of a microcosm, right? Maybe a husband says something to the wife, but they don't want to say it to the kids because it might come out at school. And you're just not sure. Do the other parents think this way? Or are we just weirdos that think, hey, our rationing system is kind of bullshit? And these protests really prove that many, many, many people are like-minded and they want big changes because a couple gutsy people go out in the street and say this, and everyone, like you said, the IE goes, you know what? While we're on a roll of this lockdown thing, I do agree with the fact that this is broken and this is broken and this is broken and this is broken. You're right. This is not good. And so you start to see in public, which is why the government always wants to prevent gatherings and people chatting online, you do see that a lot of people agree with you. And it's in the Communist Party's best interest to stifle that discussion so that everybody thinks that they are an island and alone.
Yes.
And that's failing here.
It is, and it's something that I saw often when I was in China, is that there was always, let's say, like when I was teaching university, right? There was always one kid in the class that was just like, he didn't gel with the other people, right? And he would always be better at English, and he would be better at kind of thinking outside the box. He probably had a VPN. He was reading outside news and stuff. And that person was a weirdo. That person was like, not ostracized because it's like nobody's calling him a traitor or anything like this, but he's just weird. He doesn't blend in with everyone else, right? And that's by design. It's this kind of idea that you have to fit in, right? Yeah. You have to fit in, right? But at the same time, it's not that all the kids that ostracized him didn't agree with him. It's not that they actually thought what he thought was wrong. It's just because he stuck out, right? And that's what's necessary in China, in a collective society / in a society where everything is dictated by the government. If you have enough people come out and say it, then it turns out that a lot of people actually believe that, right? And so the Chinese government's done many things to preempt this. There's this Harvard study that they always use in talking about the satisfaction of the people. The 90% of Chinese people are satisfied with the central government, right? When they don't actually have any perceived interaction with the central government.
Most people aren't allowed to speak, but the ones that we allowed to speak and answer the survey were, by and large, very happy
with the government. It's just flawed from the get-go because what you're talking about is a repressed society where people are not going to be transparent in that survey. Number two, they don't have their perceived image of Beijing or Xi Jinping is very different than what they deal with, the bullshit that they deal with at home with their local government. The Chinese government has successfully created this image of an infallible kind of palace in Beijing that dictates everything supremely and it can't be wrong. But then anything you deal with, if you have any transgressions against government and there's a factory that's caused all the kids in the village to have cancer and there's a unsolved rape case from a CCP official in your village. All the stuff that I saw when I was in China, that's just local. Again, that's just blaming the local populace, the local government, and that's nothing to do with Beijing. So the propaganda works to a certain extent, but I think, like you said, when these protests kicked off, people kind of finally saw outside the box and stopped being apathetic to the situation and said, wait a minute, there is some bullshit going on.
I want to talk a little bit about the physical and technical controls over COVID in China, because I think people go lockdowns. Okay, wait, but they're really locked in their building? It's actually worse than that in a lot of ways. It's not, for those of us that live in a free society, argue as we might about what we're free in and what we're not. Physically being locked in your apartment is crazy. And also the barriers that are outside. So even when you do get a pass to go out, you can't just go wherever you want. There were drones flying. I mean, there's footage on the China show, your show, where there are drones flying around between high rises, and there's a loudspeaker, and it says something like, please close your windows. Please do not bang pots and pans or whatever. And it's just the most Orwellian, crazy, dystopian, cyberpunk, whatever stuff that I've ever seen in real life. And I've been to North Korea. They just don't have the technology to repress like this.
Yeah, I have to make the comparison. It's just North Korea with technology now. But yeah,
it is.
The physical lockdowns were, I think a lot of you guys probably saw the footage of people getting welded into their houses and stuff. And obviously that wasn't the government standard or something. These were outlier cases, but there was enough to cause, serious alarm abroad when those videos went out. The real stuff that people went through was, the barriers, the gates around their complex, the not being able to go to work, to go to eat. I think with lockdown, at least in the West or in different countries, I mean, I'm going to say, I'll use America as an example. They remember those 2 weeks where they couldn't go on their favorite hiking trail or their favorite restaurant, or they couldn't visit their grandma or something, right? That was that's what they remember. They say, oh, a lockdown's kind of like that. I think it's like, there's a weird dissonance in people's minds about what lockdown actually means. In China, what it meant is arbitrarily being stuck in your apartment. You can't go to work. You can't earn money in many cases. You can't buy food. You can't do anything. Everything is at the whim of the government. So to zoom in on a place like in Shanghai, you had the government go, we're going to lock you all down for months, and you're not going to be able to actually leave your apartment, but we'll make sure you're fed. And even that fell through, right? There were cases of people starving to death. People were getting rotten vegetables. There was corruption in this supposedly infallible system of China where, maybe we're a bit brutal and we're kind of like North Korea with technology, but at least we take care of our citizens. We get stuff done, big infrastructure projects or big movements like getting food to people. It all falls flat because there was corruption involved. People were selling the vegetables, selling all of the food. People weren't getting their deliveries. The deliveries were getting stolen and pilfered and sent to other places. So it just didn't work. And so people started to get worried. It's like, okay, you can lock me down. You can cause me mental and emotional distress. You can cut me off from the rest of the world. But at least I can take care of my most basic needs. And the Chinese government simply just couldn't do that. So you had a situation where people were literally ostracized from all society, potentially for years. I mean, there was a place, I don't want to go into too many anecdotes. There was a place in Qinghai province, this is kind of near Tibet, where people for 4 months were locked inside of a wet market, like where you buy food and vegetables. They were locked in there.
Like they went to the store to go buy some food, and then they just couldn't leave, and they stayed there for 4 months.
You're stuck in Dollar General. You're
stuck in Dollar General for 4 months.
Yes.
That's where you're stuck for 4 months.
Jokes aside, imagine that one anecdote gets out like this, how much this is happening throughout the country. And again, I think Shanghai and big, well-represented places got hyper-covered because there's lots of foreigners there, or it's well-known. But there are so many places in China, in the countryside or outside the major cities, where these people have been locked for months and months and months, literally in their tiny, tiny box in the sky apartment where they can't do anything or leave or even sometimes get fresh air. I mean, the Chinese government was trying to get people to close their windows at some point and not let people sing out the window. It's truly dystopian, right? And again, I think that the Chinese populace is probably the one
Yeah.
population of people that could really put up with a lot. We say in Chinese, we say 吃苦, which means like eat bitter. The ability to eat bitter and to suffer. I mean, the Chinese are unparalleled in their ability to do so. It's just been a repressive society for really all of eternity. And I think it's just gotten to the point where even the Chinese are like, this is just too much.
I think you're right. Although I wonder, in a competition to 吃苦, to eat, suffer and eat bitter, who would win? Who would win, the Chinese or the Russians, man? It's close. These are two societies that are like professional level, take shit from their regime for decades / centuries at a time.
I think I'm going to give it to the Chinese just because is oppressive and repressive as Russia is, China just takes the cake. Like, there are so many things still that you could do in Russia that you can't do in China, right? The internet is still just absolutely more blocked and cut off from the rest of the world than Russia is. Although Russia's, it's quickly catching up. Yeah,
that's true. We'd have to add in the Soviet Union and everything, though, and then the great leap forward we got over in China. Yeah, it's a tough competition. Jokes aside, though, I think this brings up a greater point here, which is that economic freedom was one of the only actual freedoms, and I'm putting that in air quotes, that people had in communist China. And that's now eroded because the unspoken deal has always kind of been, in the last 20, 30 years, don't question the Chinese Communist Party. You can earn a living, you can start a business, you can engage in capitalism, and you can bring your family's standard of living up a zillion notches from this agrarian subsistence farming that they were doing even in like the 80s, right? But you don't question the power of the party. You don't question the type of government we have. You don't question the officials. But this is starting to chip and crack because now the economic freedom is gone. You're locked in your apartment. You can't run your business. Your restaurant is closed. The government's not going to help you. They're not even going to feed you. They're going to, like you said, send you rotten stalks of vegetables that have been stripped of leaves because the person who was distributing them decided to sell those for a profit and take the money for himself. And so that unspoken deal, that bargain, is no longer even being held up by the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. And so people are starting to say, well, wait a minute. We put up with your bullshit because you were allowing us to do these other things, but now you're going to take those away and leave us with nothing? Yeah. Okay, fine. Now we're going to throw plates out the window or whatever. And, they were going to put up with the daily COVID testing that you needed. They were going to put up with the QR code. Actually, tell us about this, the QR code system on the phone. Can you describe this a little? This is also quite dystopian and Orwellian.
Yeah, so there's a QR code system that Chinese people are forced to use, where you basically need a QR code on your phone to get into anywhere, right? You're not allowed to get on a bus. You're not allowed to get on a train. You're not allowed to get into your work building. You're not allowed to go into a grocery store or a wet market or anything. Every single facet of life needs this QR code, and you're only allowed to get into these places if that QR code is green, right? If it's yellow, if it changes to yellow, that means someone in the area has, there's a case, or there's at least a warning of a case, right? Then if it's red, it means that you yourself have been directly in contact with COVID. So that means you're sent off to the quarantine camps, right? At least that's what it was until fairly recently. So this QR code system has dictated everyone's life for the past, a couple of years that it's been implemented. And it's really proven that this whole thing for the Chinese government was less about COVID and more about a control mechanism for the people, because what has been demonstrated time and time again is that there have been protests leading up to what we've seen recently, the big ones. And what happens is, let's say a bank refuses to give people their investments, right? All of a sudden, people crowd around the bank and they hold up placards and they're like, hey, bank, give me some money. What the government will do is they can manually, because let's be honest, it's controlled by the central government, they can just turn everyone's codes to red, right? So then that protest gets dispersed, everyone gets arrested, everyone goes to quarantine camps, or everyone, sometimes just gets scared and leaves, right? So it's a real control mechanism that has stopped people from going to places the government doesn't want them to, and also tracks everyone where they go. I mean, this is all tied to your locations as well. It's where you go, where you usually are, where you're going to be. And this is now handed over to the central government. This is all information to track every single citizen in the entire country. It's really just a dream come true.
Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show.
What's wild about, and look, contact tracing on its face, hey, it seems like a good idea. You know, if somebody near you got infected, you can quarantine voluntarily, but that's not really what's happening with this QR code system. What's happening is the government is, of course, using it to track where people are going, but tell me about this bank protest, because this was just the most obvious glaring abuse of the QR code system for completely not legit reasons.
I mean, this actually happened a ton of times throughout the country, but the bank protest is a good catalyst. So in Hunan, some people were protesting because the banks were basically scamming them out of their money, for lack of better words. And so naturally in China, there are a lot of protests in China, as long as they're not against the government. There's protests against, like, let's say your building management is failing, or let's say what's it called? There's a thing that's happening with Japan. So you're allowed to protest against Japan, and the government even stokes some of those things. And it gives this impression that, hey, yeah, protests are allowed in China. But there's never really protests against any sort of government body, right? We can go back to the same thread. China doesn't want people protesting against the government. So this Hunan bank protest thing happened. People started protesting the bank, but also protesting the local government for not doing anything about the banks, right? For not like getting their money, forcing the banks to give them their money. So when the people protested, the government used the QR code to change everyone to red to disperse the protests, right? So this is another control mechanism. They've done this multiple times. When everyone's QR code goes to red, a lot of people are going to disperse, and then they actually have legal, kind of on the face, legal ways to move people to quarantine camps and stop those protests.
Crazy, right? So basically they'll just say, oh, look, everyone around you is infected. You better go in. And it's, again, completely just for control. Like, we don't really want you protesting this. So what we're going to say is that you've been infected, or that you are going to be infected. Now you can't go in you can't go in transit. You can't go in restaurants. You literally just have to go home. And if I would assume if the police catch you outside and you have a red QR code, you get arrested.
Yes,
or something.
yes. It's not necessarily criminal. It's more like you go to, you go to your quarantine camp. You go into that, those capsules, those basically, 18-wheeler capsules that they've repurposed for locking people up. And a huge chunk of the economy is actually running off of COVID testing and these kind of quarantine facilities now.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. Which is crazy because they're trying to implement a lot of changes in China to reduce some of the restrictions for the COVID policies, but they've built a huge chunk of their economy around this. And they've also, I think you brought up a really good point when you said there was this unspoken rule that if you let people make money or you let people have their business, they're going to have no reason to protest because, yeah, we can be an authoritarian country and, yeah, you're not allowed to say or do what you want, but you got money, which means it's better than Mao's time. It's better than the Great Leap Forward / Cultural Revolution. It's not that bad. And if people have that recent memory in their mind about how life was so poor and terrible, then making money just makes everything better. And that's how China's kind of allowed to their citizens to keep going. It's like, okay, yeah, as long as every year you get a little bit richer than you were last year, then everything's going to be fine. Nobody's going to actually have a problem. And that's by and large been the case. Not to say that people didn't have massive transgressions with the government, but by and large, as a general huge populace, people have been okay to do that. And for the first time, we're seeing under the current regime, and that's just not the case. The economy is basically, just imagine a plane just nosediving into the ground right now. Because what the Xi Jinping regime has done is completely forgotten why China's gotten to where it's been now. They've completely lost the plot. Western investment, foreign companies experimenting with capitalism, opening up its economy to the rest of the world is why China is where it is today. It's the fact that it was allowed to earn money and they allowed the people to earn money is why China is where it is today. It's why it has global influence. And now to say delude, I think it's a delusion, but I think that a lot of the top leadership and Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with so many yes men that it's gotten into a lot of people's heads that the only reason China's wealthy is actually because of the Chinese government.
Right.
It's actually because of government policy. Yes.
There's always the dictator trap. They're surrounded. They get rid of people who tell them things they don't want to hear, and people are afraid to tell them the truth from the ground up. So even if you have, let's say you have a couple good advisors around you who you say, look, really, I need to hear the truth from you. The people below them aren't going to tell them the truth, or the people below them aren't going to tell them the truth. So if you think, look, we have enough, let's say PPE, right? Masks and ventilators or something, or vaccines. Yeah, vaccines are good. The program's going great. Well, how do you know that? Because the people under you lied, and the people under him lied, and the people under him lied, and the local officials were afraid to tell the guys. So there's 17 levels of people kind of bullshitting. Or kind of fudging, or being afraid. And you have to make sure that there's no fudging and that there's accurate checks and balances in all those people, and none of that is in place. So even if you're surrounded by great advisors, are those people surrounded by officials that can tell them the truth? And are those mid-level people also working above a bunch of other people that can tell them the truth? Because if there's a little bit of corruption at every level, or even a lot, which there is, you really have no idea what your vaccination rate is or what your where the PPE is stored. And I think that's kind of what Russia's dealing with right now. You know, it's not necessarily that Putin is this crazy, irrational guy. It's that he probably thinks he does have working tanks. He probably thinks he does have a bunch of missiles left because nobody's going to go, ooh, yeah, you know what? We sold those. But we had a hell of a vacation in Monaco afterwards. But yeah, and if those people would have told them the truth, well, would the commanders and the generals and the officers below them tell them the truth? No, absolutely not. So you end up with the same thing in China. Nobody knows what's going on at the top because nobody wants to get, nobody's, the shooting of the messenger is a thing, especially
it is a real
in dictatorships.
Thing. China had a semblance of checks and balances, nowhere near like a liberal democracy, but a semblance of checks and balances because there were different power cliques within the party. There was different gangs within the party that would keep each other in check and kind of come together and say, well, next term, we're going to appoint someone that represents this and this and this principle, right? And because Xi Jinping got rid of all opposition, all those cliques, all those people that held different ideals. Maybe one guy was more like, I think we should have more communist principles that actually have social programs for people in the countryside. Then another guy says, we should definitely focus more on the coastal regions because that's the economic driver of the country. They can come together and be like, yeah, we hate each other and we're not in the same clique and we're actually diametrically opposed to each other and we're actually trying to like depose each other. But there's so many people involved that it creates this bizarre, almost pseudo-functional system within China
like
that
Congress.
has been eradicated.
They're shooting each other in the foot, but they have to play the game.
Yes.
So stuff actually ends up getting balanced at some level in a weird way.
At some level, in a weird way, right? And it's nowhere near a liberal democracy, but it kind of works. It keeps China from going into chaos. And now we're looking at China where it's tanking its own economy, thinking that it's the government's the only reason that it got to where it is. And the people are not getting that unspoken rule. They're not getting the returns on anything. They're watching their money dry up and they're watching more restriction come in return getting nothing for it. So again, huge catalyst for the protests.
So why doesn't the government just scrap the zero COVID policy? And this is the question that because of course, Xi Jinping, look, the guy can watch international news. He, at this point, has enough data to know that this isn't working, regardless of what the people below him are saying. But there's obviously other reasons, and one of those has to be the vaccination rate in China. I know they make a domestic vaccine that doesn't really work. What else is going on here?
Just to highlight that real quick, people talk about how America was like really like a lot of Americans were anti-vax, or there were just not that many people that were getting vaccinated compared to other, countries that they use as examples. But China is a real example of how the elderly people just didn't want to get vaccinated. They just didn't want to get vaccinated. A huge chunk of them didn't. So that left a very vulnerable populace unable to handle COVID. And you have to understand, I think a lot of people have been affected in some way, shape, or form by Chinese propaganda, thinking China is probably some sort of authoritarian first world country, a country that's it's built up, it's got wealth. But the medical infrastructure, China's infrastructure is terrible by and large throughout the country. I had better medical treatment when I went to Laos versus China. China's medical infrastructure, medical infrastructure is horrible. So it's just wholly unprepared for this. But at the same time, there's other reasons too. If you look at you use it as an example.
So to put a cap on that, an outbreak of COVID would kill a lot of people because of low vaccination rate, bad medical facilities, lack of care for a lot of other people in the country, especially in the countryside. So they can't risk that. Low vaccination rate aside, because there's going to be people who say, hey, the vaccine's not that effective now against Omicron and other variants. What's the difference? They're unprepared for even a regular outbreak of a light variant of COVID, potentially.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely like an excuse used for the mass COVID lockdowns and stuff for sure. That's definitely a part of it. At the same time, also, there's a huge, the most important reason here to understand why the zero COVID thing went on for so long is because every leader of China has to be known for something. So Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping, each one of those has something that they're known for, right? It's like a legacy to go forward. This leader did this, right? Chairman Mao is the easiest one to use as an example. That's what we use. He made the new China. It's called Xinjang.
I thought you were going to say killed 80 million of his own people, but you meant a legacy that they want to be remembered by. Got it.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah. So let's use legacies that they want to proliferate. Xinjang, New China. That is what China is now called. In China, Chairman Mao created that. He made it independent from other countries' influence. He separated it. He made it truly independent. It's not a puppet state, as they teach in schools. So every leader needs one of these things. You have Deng Xiaoping, who did reform and opened the economy and actually allowed China to have money. Every leader has its thing. And so Xi Jinping, when he was put into office, he never really had anything. There was nothing other than he kind of brought some state jobs back and put more into state enterprises and made the economy worse. There was only negative attributes. There was nothing that made him better than Hu Jintao, the leader before him. There was nothing that made Xi Jinping stand out. So it was almost the perfect thing. It was the perfect event to have something like COVID where he sees the rest of the world being ravaged. He sees, him, and I'm not speaking from him, I can say his leadership, his cabinet, looks at the rest of the world and says, look at millions of people dying. Because millions of people did die of COVID, right? It was devastating. If you use that as an example, you use a global pandemic, one of the most tumultuous times in our history, in modern times, in modern history, and you become the hero of that, you prevent your people from succumbing to that death and destruction, then you are a hero. You're an absolute legend in the party leadership. Now, when you create something such a crazy control method like zero COVID policy, when you create something so stifling and it looks so archaic and arbitrary and out of left field to the rest of the world, at least to your own people, you've convinced them that you saved their lives. When that starts to unravel, when your own people say, wait a minute, this is bullshit. No one's getting saved from this. We've just had 3 years of absolute torture and lockdowns, and our lives have been upended, and nothing will be the same. Then all of a sudden, it looks really, really bad, right? Mm-hmm. Now the leader is actually guilty of something negative. It's not that beautiful, positive thing that he could take for the rest of his reign, and then the next leader's on. We'll look back at Xi Jinping for being the hero of this. Is now a negative attribute. It's now actually the worst thing. It's the first time we've seen people say central government step down, right? And that's terrifying. The worst thing the Chinese government can do is lose face. A loss of face is the most dangerous thing for the Chinese government. So that's why this had to kind of keep going. And that's why, I don't know if you want me to get into this, why it's morphing into what it is.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. I want to put a cap on this as well. So the Chinese Communist Party cannot appear to be wrong.
No,
in part
ever.
Because the legacy, the face element, which is especially prevalent. It's a very Asian sort of Chinese thing where you can't be embarrassed. You can't show any sort of weakness or humiliation. Also, a lot of political capital and propaganda have been invested by the Chinese Communist Party in saying that the Chinese communist way of life is better than the West. Look, we have low deaths. We've handled COVID so much better. So stepping back is going to look like, well, wait, shoot. Did we maybe overstep here? Did we do this for too long? Did we miscalculate? They can't afford to do that. Another thing is here, and to sort of tie this in with Russia, authoritarian regimes, their mandate, when you got a dictator, when you have a super strong central authority like this, authoritarian regimes, their mandate is only or almost only based on strength, right? If you're a strong man, your mandate is that you're strong. That's why they call it a strong man. So you either stick to the zero COVID policy and piss people off, or you loosen up and you have people question why this went on for so long. That's why Putin can't just go, you know what, this Ukraine thing, holy crap, this was a big mistake. What a mess I created. Let's back out of this. He can't do that. His mandate is, I'm tough, we're tough, let's tough this out, let's get through this together. But if he says, you know what, maybe we're not so tough, then everybody goes, well, what the hell am I listening to you for then, man? The only value you have is that you're tough, that you're strong, that you know what to do. So they can't afford a single crack or stain on that image. That's all they have. That's all that's keeping them from getting hung outside from a lamppost at this point.
That's exactly right. Spot on.
So what is your prediction for how this plays out? You said this was morphing into something else. What happens here?
I'd like to riff off of some of the headlines I keep seeing, or some of the, news commentary I see. I think it really does a massive disservice to the protesters, because what I'm seeing now in, most media outlets is that the protests work to some extent because the COVID restrictions are coming down, or they're being morphed or changed or adjusted. And to a certain extent, that's correct, but it's actually the opposite of what's being portrayed. To an outside viewer that's going to look at a headline, I remember you sent me a headline the other day, right?
Yeah, the other day. I was like, hey, is this legit? It looks like they're capitulating. Not really.
The article you sent me isn't wrong, okay? The article you sent me is factual, but the headline is really throwing people off, because what it's doing in its own soft power way is convincing Westerners that China budged. China said, you know what? The people have spoken. The People's Republic of China have stood up and said, no more of this zero COVID nonsense. And the government listened and said, you know what, people? Yeah, we listened to you. And in fact, that's just not what's happened. What's happened is a massive last-ditch attempt to save face. What we are seeing right now, and I just want to go back to this, is mass arrests of anyone that went to the protests. Anyone that went near the protests are getting questioned. There are secret police and police busting down people's doors and arresting people that were holding up A4 sheets of paper. Busting down doors of people that put some graffiti up, or even just went to the crowd that was protesting against the zero COVID policy, right? This is what's currently happening and not being covered, because it's kind of akin to what happened to Tankman. We don't talk about what happened to him afterwards. That's what's happening now. A massive, huge crackdown. The real bloodbath is happening behind closed doors, behind the scenes. The government is making sure that anybody involved wasn't listened to. They're punished. They're arrested, and their lives are over. They'll never be able to participate in society normally again, right? They'll never be able to join the government or get a state job or anything like this. So what's happening now is that the government is finding the best way to avoid this from happening again. They do not want to see more protests happen. Because what happens when more protests happen is maybe next time the police actually join the protesters.
Right.
Maybe next time the PLA and the riot police actually join with the people that are calling
People's
for
Liberation
the CCP
Army.
to step down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I can see this. New York Times, the article that I sent you, which we'll link in the show notes, and other major media outlets, they haven't really been talking about this. And let me know what you think here. Protests cannot be seen as a vector for change, just as you were saying. If the Chinese Communist Party changes course now, it looks like what they're saying is, all right, protests work. That's very, very bad for an authoritarian regime, right?
Yes.
Mainstream media, and I also hate that phrase, but they say the government can't be seen to be wrong. I get that. But I think in a media environment with censorship, without free speech, you can spin whatever you want. Come on.
Yeah.
You can spin that.
Yeah.
The bigger issue is now that people are asking for democracy and transparency and other rights of communication, and if they're protesting for zero COVID to end and they get their wish that way, let's say they get zero COVID to end that way, they go, wait a minute, protests work. So now why go home now? We got zero COVID lockdown to end. Let's keep talking about democracy and transparency. That sets a really, really bad precedent because then people will say, great, okay, so if we want more rights, all we got to do is throw a big national protest and we might get our way. Let's not stop at ending lockdowns. Let's get freedom like we failed to do in 1989. And that is the worst nightmare of the Chinese Communist Party, is people thinking that if they just actually fight the government, they can win, because they can. There's 1.4 billion people. I know a lot of them are in the CCP, but they're, how loyal are you when you can actually have freedom? I mean, we're talking about a huge number of people. It's just, it could get very ugly very quickly if this gets out of control. And the way to get it out of control is to say that this might be effective.
Yeah, so it's a dual pronged approach. I think what we're seeing is the soft power they're allowing to proliferate in the West is to say, yes, Westerners, please believe we allow protests. In China, it's a show of force. It's to say, hey, the neighbor that went to the protest just got disappeared. Hey, There's a mass arrest right now in Guangzhou for anyone that held up a piece of paper, right, from between November 27th to December 3rd. If you were there, then you're getting arrested, right? That's what they're showing in China. So there's two different kind of displays. Now, what they're doing to save face for the zero COVID thing is, yes, they are rolling out massive changes, but they're not saying that zero COVID was a failure. They're saying that zero COVID was a success. These 3 years were necessary because what they found after all this time is that finally COVID morphed into something that wasn't dangerous. And actually, the top medical experts in the country have found out that COVID's not even COVID anymore. It's actually just a type of flu. So no one has to worry that much anymore. And it's a way of saving face because Omicron's been on Omicron for how long now, right? They've had state media go out there and say Omicron doesn't actually exist. It's actually super, super dangerous. And now the state media is saying, oh, actually, it's not that dangerous anymore. And now we can actually look at ways to kind of reduce some of the regulation and stuff. There's two things to take away from this. The government doesn't want to lose face and wants to justify what these 3 years of lockdown were. Simultaneously, the government wants to look like a hero for doing that and having all those measures in place for 3 years so that the people can say, oh, thanks for saving my life, government. And then the second thing is that they already got what they wanted. They got the control mechanism and actually instituted it in every single daily facet of life. Every single facet of life is revolving around government tracking and control and location services and QR codes. All of that stuff has been entrenched into society now. So the government does have a control mechanism for the future on from now to know and track every single citizen in the country. So it's almost like a win-win for them domestically, and then almost a soft power win for Westerners to look at the news and say, hey, maybe they actually gave in to the protesters.
So do we have a prediction for how this plays out? Because I know before we heard that they were going to pretend to budge, I think you and I agreed on this. We were going to say the Chinese Communist Party has to change course, but then claims victory, moves the goalposts, then covers up the deaths and the infection rates among the public for the next 3 to 5 years. And, that's so far so good, I guess, as far as my prediction being accurate. I wouldn't say it's good in any other way.
I think I wouldn't adjust that. I mean, that's where we're at. There's no way they're going to do anything else. I mean, they've already reported no deaths, right, from this. So we're going to be in a situation where it's just like the zero poverty, like the whole Xi Jinping needs to go down in history for eradicating poverty. He gets on a podium and says, poverty's over. Did you hear, guys? Poverty's over. And everyone's like, what are you talking about? Like, there's no running water in this village over here. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? There's abject poverty all over the countryside in China, but Xi Jinping made it illegal to say that there's poverty because then the law is you're picking quarrels and starting rumors, right? This is what we're going to see with the COVID thing. There's not going to be any more transparency or any more opening up here. It's just going to be illegal to tell the truth. Just like always, there will be a government narrative. It'll be portrayed as this is how the government wants it to be seen going forward. And if you speak out against that, then you're arrested.
I was hoping we would have some positive news as a result of this, especially because we saw that article the other day about them potentially ending the lockdowns, but it just seems like we're still on the same course we were before with a fresh coat of paint.
I think really what it is there is some positive news, and that is the restrictions are being, relinquished to some extent. There is a lot of, it looks like it's going to happen throughout the country. I'm still talking to people that are like, nothing has changed where they are, but it's, predictably a mess. There's very, very little continuity throughout China. It's really way more disorganized and messy and disconnected than people probably think, just because they consume so much of, China's propaganda that goes to the outside world. But what we're seeing is a huge mess. But I think the positive here is that, yes, the arbitrary, crazy, unbelievable, dystopian lockdown stuff is probably changing and going away. It's just that we're not really pointing the right blame. We're not pointing fingers at the right person. We're not blaming the right person. And I feel like China is really trying to alter history here and spin this in a way that, really serves their narrative and almost emboldens or empowers the top leadership. But I do have another prediction, and that's people aren't stupid in China. This might go away for a little while and most people might be placated. But like you said, some people, educated people, people that saw through this, that knew that this was from the top, that were protesting for the right reasons, they're not going to change their mind and think that everything's okay anymore. And I think this could be the start of a very fragile and tumultuous time for the CCP.
Well, hopefully we see a regime change there in a way that doesn't end up killing hundreds of millions of people in China. That's my wish. And I always say this in every episode that I do about China, which is this is not an anti-Chinese episode. It's an anti-Chinese Communist Party episode. And the victims of the Chinese Communist Party always have and always will be primarily the Chinese people themselves.
Yes, agreed.
So thank you very much for coming on, man. Really appreciate the update. Thanks for keeping us, bringing us back in the loop.
Thank you, Jordan. Appreciate it. Love the show.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.